Hey guys, Stephanie here with the Aeroponic Tower channel, and of course right when I start to film this, one of the tanks kicks on. You can hear in the background that I am growing using a system called hydroponics, and actually a form of hydroponics called aeroponics. And I chose aeroponics because hydroponics is a horizontal system, and it just required more space and different lights and things that I wasn't able to do on my own in our space. Where if I grow aeroponically, I can grow vertical and grow up into the air. And what's happening is inside these containers is basically a channeling system. So the water goes from a bottom reservoir, it's pumped to the top, it has all the nutrients in it, water soluble nutrients, and then it drips down onto the roots that are inside this tube. So the plant roots are exposed to air most of the time, and then the water trickles on them where they can absorb the nutrients that they need, and it recycles. So the water drips down, anything not consumed drips down back into the water reservoir, and the process is repeated on an automatic timer. Depends whether you're growing inside or outside. These systems are set up automatically. If you're growing inside, the timer is set to come on every 45 minutes and stay on for 15 minutes. And that's how long the system's gonna pump water into the top reservoir where it'll drip on the roots, and then nothing's happening for 45 minutes. When we move our towers outside, that changes to a system where it's on every 12 minutes and the pump runs for 3 minutes. Reason being, when we're outside, the plants are gonna get a lot hotter and be a lot more dry. So we have to be more frequent with how we turn on our system when they're outside growing. Today, I want to specifically talk about hydroponic kale and how we can grow kale year-round using a hydroponic or an aeroponic tower garden. And I don't know if you can hear that. Actually, now it's starting to trickle down and it's pretty quiet. It was loud before because this tank is almost empty. You ideally don't want to let your tanks get past halfway full because we want to make sure there's a good amount of nutrients always available in that water, because the plants are going to suck those up as they need them. That's what makes this a really cool system, because we can give plants exactly what they need. But if we're letting our tanks run too low, then they might be trying to pull out some calcium or something that it's craving, and there's not enough in the water because all the other plants have used it up. That's ideal practice. Now, I am a homeschooling mother. I have 3 teenagers and a busy life. So sometimes my tanks go a little bit drier than they should, and that's the case with this one. And I always know because I can hear it. The pump sounds different as the water goes below that halfway mark. I'm growing beautiful, amazing plants on this tower, even with the water lower. So I'm not super concerned about that. The best practice is don't let it get past halfway, but if it does, it's not the end of the world. I'll fill this up today, make sure it has everything it needs, and then anything those plants are trying to grab that's not available in water now because it's all been used up possibly, and that's just a theory too. We don't really know how many nutrients are left in there. I personally tend to lean towards it has more than enough because I never see deficiencies in my plants, and I often let my tank run pretty low. But I want to teach you guys best practices and keep you informed, so just be mindful of that. And once I add the water and the nutrients, then they can suck up anything they were missing anyway. The only thing I plan to eat off this tower is I'm gonna harvest some cilantro that's starting to bolt, and I'm gonna juice it. It's already had tons and tons of nutrients because it's gotten to its full mature state, so I'm not really worried about that. So I just wanted to kind of fill you in a little bit on that. But let's dive into growing hydroponic kale, because that's what we're here for today. There are some really important reasons to be growing your own kale right now. And now lots of the towers are running, and I often turn them on, but people play music in the background of their videos. I'm gonna play tower garden water fountain in the back of mine because this is real life, and my goal here is to really guide people who are trying to grow most of their own food using aeroponic towers. And so doing that is showing you real life experiences and what it really looks like to grow. So I'm in my garage right now, and this is probably the last day these towers are going to be in the garage. Someone had asked if I could show how I set these up in the garage. Typically, they are just set up in a row. I have 6 that I grow in the winter, and 6 seems to be the right amount of towers to feed our family of 5 all winter long with greens. I didn't do a lot of peppers and tomatoes this winter and eggplant because I didn't time it right where they would be fruiting. So I may try to incorporate another 2 towers in this garage next winter. with the mindset of having peppers and eggplants and tomatoes all year round. But 6 was plenty for growing all of our own greens, our lettuce, our cabbages. We grew a lot of bok choys, Swiss chard, all of our herbs, things like basil, all of that. So I had them in a row in the garage that took up about the spot that a small car would take up. You want at least 1.5 feet in between each tower. Now, because I'm only growing greens in the winter in this garage, or I only grew greens in the winter in the garage this year, I didn't have to worry about as much airflow and as much space that you might need if you were trying to grow peppers and tomatoes, squash and things like that. Because if they're really tight and in a tight space without a lot of airflow, you can get diseases on those type of plants. So just know, if you are growing just greens, they can be pretty close together without any problems. I can't show how they were set up because I've already started to move them to the garage door. And the reason is you need to harden off your plants if you're going to move them outside in the spring or any other season. So what that means is you start exposing them to natural sunlight a few hours a day, so that they're not going to go into shock and burn up, because they do need to have time to transition. Same with your seeds, and I'm going to talk about that when we dive into our hydroponic kale specific conversation. But that's what's happening now. I'm kind of rotating the towers out. I actually put all the towers outside last week, and that is my goal, to get them outside permanently. But then we had a couple of cold evenings, and because I've already have peppers and eggplants and tomatoes, zucchini squash. I have some squash plants that are already a couple of feet big, and those cannot handle any of those cool temperatures. So I had to move everything back in. So what I do is just kind of slide it all back in, and that means it's jammed up all near the door here, which is totally fine, because it's a temporary thing. Our last frost, we're zone 6B, our last frost is after Mother's Day. Now, we tend to be a little bit warmer here than I have heard some 6B zones are. We have had a warm winter, so they are ready to go out, and this, I'm hoping today, which is the 10th of April, will be our last day in the garage, but I can't be certain of that. So I'm just prepared. I'm not gonna put them in their final place for growing all summer until we get past that frost date, but I will push them out into the sun and let them start to get full exposure to the sun. The difference between growing indoors and outdoors, and I'll talk specifically about kale since this video is supposed to be about kale, but I keep talking about other things. But the difference is when you're growing indoors, because I'm using artificial lights. So Tower Garden has these lights. They're full spectrum LED, they're flexible. I have pushed this one over the top of my head so it's out of the way. But because we're growing under artificial lighting, things go a little bit slower or get less big. So it just depends on the plant. And I'm going to show you guys some kales that I've been growing indoors. None of this was started outside and has been exposed to outside weather more than a couple of hours. These are all plants that were grown from seed to now inside this garage. And what it does is some plants will tend to stay a little bit smaller depending on the variety and the plant, and some things grow just a little bit slower. A great example of that is a tot soy. This plant right here is tot soy. I absolutely love it. This is in the bok choy family. It's just a small bok choy. And growing in the garage in the winter, this has been the largest I've been able to get these. And that's it. They're ready to harvest, or they'll start to want to go to seed after this. But now that I've been able to move a couple of them outside, let me show you the difference. This one right here was the exact same size up until about a week ago when I started exposing it to sunlight. This tower has been pushed to the front of the garage where it's starting to be hardened off and getting a couple hours of real sunlight. And it's significantly bigger than I've been able to grow any over the winter in the garage. So just be mindful of that. And it's the same with kale. My kale tends to stay smaller indoors and grow a little bit slower if I'm growing inside. And then outside, it speeds up and definitely explodes in size. Now, it also depends on the variety. So I'm gonna go through a couple of varieties and I will show you one that does grow much larger inside. All right, and I had to put that plant back, but you can totally pull your plants in and out of your towers. So never feel like if you set your tower up and then you move it outside and some things grow a lot bigger than you thought they were gonna be, or that they grew all winter, you can move things around. It's not a big deal at all. So let's go through some kales. First off, talk about kale. So I wrote a blog post specific to nutrient benefits of kale and a lot of the reasons why we want to grow them. So I'll link that below. But one of the main ones for me is that kale is one of the most contaminated greens on the market. It hit the market as a superfood a couple of years ago. Now it's mass marketed as a superfood. Everybody eats kale. It's the thing to do. And unfortunately, that means because it's being mass produced, they're trying to grow it quickly without any problems and loading it up with all sorts of chemicals. There were some tests done and they found over 20 different chemicals on kales. So pesticides, herbicides, things like that. And I've got details of that in the blog post if you want to read more about that. But it's marketed as this clean superfood that we should all be eating, yet it's highly contaminated and exposing people to a lot of really bad pesticides and herbicides, and most people don't even know. They assume it's a health food and are eating it for that purpose and not realizing the consequences that can come with that. Then of course there's organic kale, and we always try to buy organic if we can, but grocery store prices are crazy, and so there's budget issues with that. Organic kale is also part of a monocrop system too, unless you're getting it from a CSA who's into permaculture practices and regenerating their soil. So you can still be missing a lot of really important minerals in your kale just because of the way we've gotten into this monocultural society where we're not replenishing our soil. There's lots of documentaries. I think there's a documentary called Soil or Dirt. Really great information if you want to dive into that. That question has been asked before because plants, when they're absorbing nutrients in the soil, there are bacteria in the soil, and those bacteria are what allow the plants to absorb the nutrients. It's that symbiotic relationship similar to what we have. The bacteria in our gut allows us to absorb nutrients more effectively. Same thing. And so the question was, if we're growing aeroponically in water, are we missing that component? And there's a couple of things to address with that. First, and I'm speaking in regards to all vegetables on that, but you know, I want to talk kale here because kale is a superfood. I believe it's a food we should all be eating daily, and it's highly contaminated, so growing it yourself is really important. But when you have an aeroponic system, there were studies done, or hydroponics, same thing, and they found that those bacteria were still there in almost the identical ratios as in the soil, and those bacteria were actually on the roots of the plant, not in the water, and so they still had all of that symbiotic relationship. So God is a perfect creator, in my opinion, and designed all of that to be exactly what it's supposed to be. But we also are adding water soluble nutrients into the water, and so they're going to mix in the water, and that makes them really easy to absorb by the plant roots. So there's two different things going on there. I don't know, you know, I've researched this topic a lot and I think it's still new science, but what we have discovered is yes, the nutrients are water soluble, so the plants are able to absorb them really easily in a hydroponic aeroponic system. Actually, aeroponics is the roots are exposed to air, which makes them even more efficient at absorbing nutrients. But now we also know that those bacteria are there as well. So this is not a sterile environment that some may think when we're growing in a hydroponic system. All of those things needed to make healthy plants are still there. And if you are into biological farming, like making worm teas or comfrey teas to spray on your leaves to increase the plant immunity and just the overall nutrition of the plant, you can still do that in an aeroponic system. I plan to make comfrey teas and spray my plants when they're outside as well. So we're still able to do a lot of those things. A lot of people are into the copper conductivity thing right now, and I've seen those used on the towers, and it works. So there are a lot of differences in aeroponic gardening versus in soil gardening. And for me, it was just a matter of availability. I can't grow grocery store type food year round using my permaculture food forest or my permaculture growing techniques that I have going in my yard or in my raised beds or in my no dig bed gardens. So I am a believer in building really high quality soil, and I'm working on that in the things I'm growing outside. But I've mostly shifted to growing perennial type foods and herbal medicines and things like that outside, because I can't get this food in December and in November, in January and February. We've been eating this all winter long, and it has all the nutrients. I know this probably is more nutrient dense than anything I'm growing in my soil, because I'm just in the early years of building really diverse, healthy soil. So this feeds our family. This is the absolute best option to bring the better than organic, most nutrient dense food into our homes year round. All right, so now to talk specifics on kale. Now that we've sort of addressed what is aeroponics, why I choose to grow aeroponics, why we want to grow our own kale, because it's contaminated. Food inflation is crazy. I saw 2 zucchini squash that were maybe the size of my hand and not great looking for $5 at the grocery store the other day. You can grow zucchini on these, amazing zucchini. So it's just gotten out of control with the price of food. So for me, this is about food security. It's easy to sustain these systems with very few resources after you make the initial investment into purchasing a tower. And then they've been known to last over 10 years with 0 nanoparticle breakdown for farmers who've been aeroponic farming. They don't leach any chemicals or byproducts into the water that's been tested with these. So let's talk kale. I'm going to show you guys a kale variety that I have growing, and then just specifically how you want to think about planting kale, how many seeds you want to plant, and how to start your seeds. All right, and I went and grabbed some seeds just to go over kale as a whole. So any kind of kale will grow on an aeroponic tower garden, and there's not a lot to think about. I have videos on different varieties of plants that I choose to grow based on their size and how long they take to mature. And that's not the case with kale. And the reason being, you can harvest kale as a baby green, so anywhere from 3 inches on, or you can wait until it gets really mature. You can harvest it when it's halfway grown. You can mix 10 different kale seeds and grow a bunch of kale, a bouquet of kale. I have some of those growing, and it just kind of depends what your goals are. I like to have kale available for raw salads, and in that case, I typically like to have smaller leaves, like in the 3 inches to 6 inch range. I just made a huge kale salad for company on Easter. Just on a whim, we decided to get together, and I was able to come out here and whip out an amazing kale salad for our dinner. But you can also grow some larger varieties too. So this one right here is Premier Kale. And these are by M.I. Gardner. He has the most affordable seeds on the market by far. And I'm going to show you what this looks like grown. So I grew this plant indoors, and as I mentioned, some kale or some plants in general tend to be a little bit smaller when grown indoor versus if you were growing them outside in the peak season. But this one grew really large, and I've eaten off of it a ton. So let me show you what it looks like. And so this is the Premier Kale. This is a larger leaf kale, and I've ripped off pieces of this one and eaten it. I've eaten a ton of random stems. You can kind of eat around the ring of the plant just like you would lettuce, and I've been doing that. And then there's some smaller leaves in here if you wanted the smaller ones. They're delicious, but that can cause damage to the plant to eat these smaller ones because I'm going right into the middle to get them. You typically want to eat around the plant so that it can keep growing from the middle. And what will happen as you do that, this one's broken, so we'll harvest this guy and eat him. But what will happen is as you harvest around the plant, it'll grow almost like a stalk, or almost like a trunk or a stalk. And when you have kale outside, it's the same thing. That stalk will stay there and it'll keep growing, and then sometimes they fall over. So this one is much larger and did grow, I would say, outside. If I were growing this in the spring and when this plant gets exposed to a lot more sunlight, it's going to get a lot thicker than it is right here. But this is about accurate for the size. It could get a little bit bigger than this. This is not typically what I would grow on my tower garden because it's so big without a lot of density to it. And what I mean by that is if I were to let my Russian red kale get full grown in a tower garden, It's going to be a lot more dense than this, and it's going to be a huge plant, but it's not going to have these huge wispy leaves that are coming off of it that can get in the way and shadow out other plants. So I don't know why I planted this one, honestly. Probably just felt like trying one of these seeds out, but of course it's doing amazing. It's not shading anything out. When a leaf gets in the way of another plant, I harvest it. So it's still totally doable if this were to be your favorite kale. Absolutely grow it all day long. Just wanted to share this to show there are better options for the space, because you can get a much denser kale that's not so wispy with leaves that might get in the way of other things. Now that I look at this plant, it's actually covering a romaine, and a romaine might not like all the sun when I put it out into the sun next week. So this can benefit by offering some shade to some neighboring plants like this arugula. So it's just food for thought on that. There's no 100% right or wrong way to garden on these. Some people have a theory about what you put on top. I watched a video the other day, and his advice for how he grows on his was the exact opposite of what I recommend, but he had amazing plants. And it was so interesting to me that, like, I have my systems and I grow a ton of food, and the way I grow makes sense to me, and he did something completely different and still had great food as well. So here are some other varieties. Red Russian kale, that's kind of what I mentioned. This one's going to get 15 to 24 inches in size. I've actually never seen a Russian kale be 24 inches in width. So I would say 15 is accurate, even in my in-ground gardens, but that could be just our climate. So just something to be mindful of what that looks like size-wise. But red Russian kale, you're gonna get all the benefits of the red and the purple. Talk about that in the blog post. I thought this one was really fun, and I just started these seeds. This is a feathered frizzle kale. That to me just looks like it'd be so tasty on a salad or in soups. There is Bates dwarf blue kale that I have growing. Curly kale, I like curled kale for making kale chips, but you can make kale chips out of any plants. Typically larger leaf kale leaves like this I like in soups or cooked down, and then things like this dazzling blue are excellent in salads. And this is a red Russian kale, excellent in salads and kale chips. These absorb a lot of the nutritional yeast if you're making kale chips, so it makes them super tasty. This one right here, I call it dinosaur kale. That's the one with the nice, tall, really dense green leaves. That one grows amazing on an aeroponic tower because it grows tall, and anything that grows tall and narrow works really well, because we've got our grow port here, and we put our rock wool, oh, I'm losing my plant. We put our rock wool inside one of these cages, these net pots. I always call them cages, but they're a net pot. And then the plant's gonna grow up, and there's other things that it can grow and kind of weave through. And when the plant grows up, because each net pot or each grow port is alternating, it just gives a lot of room in the middle for things that grow up and tall. So I do like the dinosaur kale grown on here. I will say indoors, it's only been grown to about half size for me. I have not been able to get those giant dinosaur kale leaves when growing inside. Outside, no problem. Indoors, they only get about half the size. So let me show you a few kale varieties, and then we'll talk about how to plant seeds and how to think through how many seeds you want to plant per rock wool. So with this premier kale, I just did one seed. Knowing that that's a big kale plant, it makes sense that I would put one seed into the rock wool so that it can get to its full size, because that type of plant is not going to be ideal for making a baby greens. I could put 10 in there, cut them when they get to 3 or so inches and let them regrow. But typically with a kale this large, I would do one seed per rock wool and give it time to mature and fill up the space in the tower, harvest it as a full green. With kale, you can do the cut and come again method, a couple of different methods for that. I typically just go eat the leaves around plants when I need to harvest something. Some things I recommend harvesting the whole plant and eating it at once and starting over. That tends to be the philosophy I follow with a lot of things, but not with kale. And the reason why is kale will continue to grow in an aeroponic tower without jeopardizing the flavor. If you're harvesting off of it, now it will start to get leggy. As I mentioned, you're eating and that stem just gets longer and longer, and then it just turns out to be weird looking, and then I start over, and I'll show you what that looks like too with one of my plants. So I'll just come look on my towers, harvest, If I need a big meal like I did yesterday for our Easter brunch, I just took a whole big bouquet of kale. It had 5 different varieties of kale in it, and I'll show you, I think I have another one similar. I harvested the whole thing, chopped it off, and we ate it, and it was amazing. So there's different ways to plant and different ways to harvest. And while I go on a hunt for some kale to show you guys, I just want to clarify with the cut and come again method, I like to take a few leaves until the plant is too stressed. I rarely ever cut off all the greens at one time and allow them to grow back. I have just found that method of cutting everything and allowing it to grow back to be a slower process than just starting over with new greens. And also it just takes up more nutrients the larger the root base is. So I just start from fresh if I harvest an entire bouquet. So I just went and took this off one of the towers, and this is an example of a bunch of kale that we will eat while the greens are babies or smaller, like this. And I've been eating off of this a ton. There's all sorts of broken stems. And what that does is it causes the plant to kind of start to grow this longer looking stem instead of allowing it to get full and wide. And I did this intentionally so we could have these nice baby greens. This is a Vates blue curly kale, and then I think this is that just blue dazzle. So it's definitely blue and purple in color. And so you can plant this way if you want to harvest baby greens, and it just gives you more access to baby greens when you grow a few seeds at one time. Now I eat off of these pretty heavily, so it's still pretty leggy, and it probably only has a couple more weeks in it before it'll get so leggy and weird that it won't be worth keeping in the tower. I'll harvest the whole thing. I like to juice the stems and start over. But if you're going for leaf sizes like this, then you're gonna do anywhere from, let's see, how many do I have in here? 1, 2, I have 5 plants in here. I would say that's the minimum if you're trying to get baby greens, anywhere from 5 to 15 seeds in your rock wool. So you can get a nice huge bouquet. The one I harvested yesterday had at least 5 different kales in it, and there must have been 15 seeds. And so this just gives you an idea of the size and how many seeds to plant. If I were to plant 1 seed, let me show you what that looks like. All right, and looking around, I don't have a ton of variety of kale on here, so sorry about that. I like to typically have 4 or 5 different varieties and sizes and if I'm gonna make these videos, but we've been eating off of these a ton. So this is a good way to show you the difference and what they're gonna look like if you're eating off of your plant a lot versus if you're just growing one plant. So here, you can see this is super leggy. I've been eating off of this one and eating off of this one, and now it's making this tree trunk type thing and getting a little bit weird. I will harvest this whole thing next time I do a juicing session, or you can freeze this and put it in smoothies. You can cook this stem. It's actually very tasty, similar to any brassica because kale's in the brassica family. So that's always an option, but you can see I forced this one to be really leggy, and there's not even a lot of new growth. There's some, but it's gonna start slowing down, and it just gets weird on the tower and it takes up space. It's not necessary. Same with this one. I harvested pretty much every leaf off of this one. So this is not going to grow back really quickly and provide me a lot of food. I would have a better result if I just started over and ate these last parts in a meal and then just start fresh, where I can get some access to really quick greens. This is not a really efficient way to continue letting it grow, because to have this stem provided by nutrients and all of these roots is taking up a lot of energy, and it's not spitting out leaves in proportion to that energy, in my opinion. And that's kind of my thoughts with aeroponic gardening in general. I tend to believe that you start a seed or a few seeds, eat the entire plant, and then you're consistently starting seeds all the time so that you can replace that plant. Because I can go harvest all of this bok choy right here. I can cut it, leaving about 1.5 inches, and it will grow back. But the base of that plant and the roots and the energy required for it to grow back is actually slower, and the inputs needed and the nutrients it's going to absorb, because the root system is so much larger, it just uses more resources, I personally believe, than starting a new set. And with a new one, it's just 1 rock wool and a couple of seeds So the cost, not sure which is more expensive, if it's using nutrients and power to feed that plant to grow back versus starting over. But I know it's faster to start over. And I do know that the more mature your plants get and the more space they're taking up in the tower, it's robbing nutrients from other plants. Because as this fills up, and you can see it kind of creates a ledge because of what the inside design of these systems are, and it fills that up. And if we're filling our tanks up with old root systems of plants that aren't really providing a lot of food for us, then it's really robbing nutrients and robbing water and robbing resources from other plants. So that's sort of my opinion on that. Okay, and with this one, I only did one seed, so I wanted to see if I could get this one to fill out, and it's definitely filling out more. I haven't been eating off of it a whole lot, so I'm not having to deal with that legginess, and I can let this turn into a very dense, I would say, span of about 20-inch plant and harvest the whole thing and eat it, or I can start to eat off of this. This is a curly leaf kale, and you can tell I've been eating off of this one too. Apparently I need to plant more kale. So growing an aeroponic tower garden, and I've made other videos on this, you have main grow ports and you have baby green section if you purchase a baby green section for your tower. These have extensions on them, and I'll link below a video if you're not familiar with what that means. But I do typically grow a lot of greens, like my kales and things, in the baby green section, all jammed up together because I eat off of them so frequently. So a kale plant, the maturity rate is anywhere from 55 to 75 days. It's pretty slow. So if we're not eating them as baby greens, sorry, my dog's sneezing. If we're not eating these as baby greens, that can take quite a lot of time. And then inside, it can be a little bit slower during the winter. So now that we're moving into spring, I'll definitely let a few of these grow to full size and then start to rotate my seeds in a way where I always have access to these in their full size state until it gets too hot to grow kale. So I can have a nice huge harvest of kale. Growing kale outside is a spring and fall and early winter crop. So early spring, late spring's kind of pushing it depending on what growing zone you're in. When they're exposed to frost and are cold, they're amazing and sweet. When you grow them towards the summer, they're gonna start to get bitter and have a little heat to them. So I grow these in the spring and in the fall outside in the towers. And then I have towers that I keep inside full time. And in the winter and in the summer, I can continue to grow kale. So we're not bound by the seasons with kale, and we're not gonna get that bitter kale if we're growing these in our house in the summer when we have our ACs running. Actually, I'm gonna put this one over here because I have a little bit more room on this side than in the tower behind me. I have lots of things to eat off of in the tower behind me. And let's see if I can find any more kale on here. So I looked around, I don't see any other kale plants that are worth showing, but I hope that gives you a picture of how you can eat and grow kale. I just went and grabbed this tray because I was going to start some new seeds, and I'm actually lacking in some tray space right now. So these are actually mostly kale, and what this is, I'll link this below. This is what I recommend for sprouting and starting your seeds. With hydroponics or aeroponics, it's actually super easy to start seeds and start a lot of them. I have a video where I talk about how I start seeds every 2 weeks based on 1/4 of the grow ports in my tower. So if I have 32 grow ports, I'm starting 8 seeds every 2 weeks. And it's not always the same seeds. I'm rotating constantly. Like right now, I know I need to be thinking about parsley and cilantro because cilantro is gonna start bolting really quickly now that it's exposed to warmer air. But that allows me to always have something ready to go in the tower. So when I pull out that kale that I said I'm gonna pull out, I actually just went ahead and decided I'm gonna juice that tonight with some other things I'm juicing because it's gotten so leggy. I can go ahead and put another one of these starts in and have something ready to rotate all the time. So what you do is you take your rock wool, this particular grow kit, because it came with these individual, it came with these, oh my gosh, my nose. It came with these individual grow sections, and that means if I'm sprouting something like tomatoes that are gonna need a different germination rate than, let's say, kale, I can do my tomatoes in one and kale in the other. Celery, for example, is very, very slow to sprout. Kale is gonna be 5 to maybe 7 days, 4 to 7 days maybe. And it's not tricky to get kale to sprout. Some things do need a little extra care and a little more attention, but I put these, I would soak my rock wool for about 20 minutes so that it's nice and moist, drain off any excess water, and then I decide how many seeds I'm gonna plant in each rock wool, cover them with a little vermiculite, pop on the dome lid, and then these go on a heat mat with the grow light on. The vermiculite allows darkness, but can also allow some light to bleed in. Some plants need light to germinate, some don't, and I've just found that's the easiest way to do it. And I have very high germination success rate in here. There are no empty rock wools. So everything I planted grew. And then after they germinate and they start to sprout, and you're gonna get, these are sprout leaves here, these little heart-shaped ones. Then you take off the dome lid and keep it on the heat mat and exposed to the lights. And eventually you can turn off the heat mat if you like, unless it's tomatoes or peppers or something like that. But with kale, you can turn off the heat mat because they're a cool weather crop. And at that point, they just start to grow. When they get to a certain size, they're ready to go into the towers. Now I have some different thoughts and philosophies. They're stuck together. Okay, I have some different thoughts and philosophies on when a plant is ready to go in the tower. When we're growing like this under the light, this gives me time. If I let this stay under the light and get a significant size for 3 weeks, that's 2 extra weeks it's not sitting in my tower. That something else can be growing, like this bok choy can do a significant amount of maturing in 2 weeks in this tower and give me a lot more food than this sitting in my tower can versus under a grow light. So I keep my plants under my grow lights for a lot longer than I think most people do. Also found that when I'm growing, I keep everything pretty dry. This is moist to the touch, but it's not dripping. If I squeeze this, water's not gonna pour out of it. When you add too much water to these, the rock wool starts to get algae, which is totally normal, but it falls apart and the seedlings can almost drown, because you can see I've got a little tiny kale in there and I've got some a little bit more mature. So if this is too wet and these start to touch on the side, they drown, rot. The success rate is less. If I put this in my tower right now, this tower is running, like I said, for 15 minutes every 45 minutes. These rock wool, if I pulled this out, I can squeeze it and tons of water would pour out of the rock wool of one of these plants. Maybe not tons, but lots of water. You would actually be able to physically see a significant amount of water pour out of those. This is designed to do that. It's designed to be super porous and very water absorbent for that reason. But if you put these in too early, same thing happens. Their chance of drowning increases significantly. I was actually looking on my tower earlier and found a couple of plants that I stuck in too early, and both of them were dead for that very reason. They just kind of got too much water and sort of rotted away. So this is not ready to go in yet. What I like to do is look for roots showing on all 4 sides plus the bottom. So I do have some roots showing on one side and on the bottom, but then I also want these leaves to be at least 1.5 inches for a kale, close to 2 inches. So I'm going to give this some time. I also don't like how it's floppy and hanging over on that rock wool. Sometimes when you put them in the tower itself will hold the plant up, but sometimes it doesn't, and again you're going to expose it to too much water and then it can rot. So I put 4 seeds in here, and this is a red Russian kale. It looks like I did 6 on that one. So anywhere from 4 to 6 with the red Russian kale. I'm just going for a dense kale that I can harvest off of frequently. Again, in that probably, 4 or 5 inch range leaf for those. So this one over here, it looks like it's a curly kale. And again, it looks like I did 3 or 4 seeds on each one of those. For the same reason, harvesting baby greens, I typically harvest the baby greens more than the large ones, although I do love kale chips, and curly kale is one of my favorite for that. You can also put these in as baby greens, harvest 3 out of the 4 plants, and then let the one continue to grow and get large too. If you want to get a little head start on food, that's another option as well. So you could be eating off of these and then have that one substantial plant as well. There are no real rules with growing kale. Growing aeroponically, it's what works best for you. Oh no, I broke this little leaf. It's just what works best for you and your diet and how you like to eat your food. Any kale will grow on this. And I hope these tips help you feel empowered to grow some aeroponic kale. If you have any questions about towers, if you want any more information, there's a link below where you can contact me and we can chat. There's a link to my website where you can find out more information based on what's being revealed that's being sprayed on these plants. It's unnecessary. We can grow this stuff year round with just a few simple resources instead of having to purchase this at a grocery store where it's exposed to chemicals, where it's trucked in sometimes from other countries, where it's wrapped in plastic or put in plastic containers that are contaminating the earth and contaminating our water sources and our food. There's microplastics in food now. So this just gives us a great option to take back some control of our food system.